The first call came just as I was enjoying my morning coffee. My phone lit up with Ethan's name, the same son who hadn't invited me to his wedding but now suddenly needed me. His voice came through sharp, laced with blame, accusing me of ruining his happiness. Minutes later, Madeline called, her tone sugary but sharp, threatening to tell everyone what a selfish mother I was. And I just sat there, calm and steady, listening to their desperation, their entitlement, their complete disregard for everything I'd endured. That's when it finally clicked for me. If they could erase me from their happiest moments, they didn't deserve me carrying their burdens. That was the day I realized I wasn't the villain. I was finally free. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, tucked between a grocery coupon booklet and a dentist's appointment reminder. I wouldn't have noticed it, except the envelope was heavy, cream-colored, and bore a name that made my breath catch. Mrs. Florence Mitchell. My eyes lingered on the handwriting, flawless, precise. Ethan always had neat penmanship, perfected through all those years in private school I'd scraped to afford. But the absence of one simple word, Mom, felt like a punch to the chest. I stood in my small kitchen in River Grove, a quiet little town where life passed gently, and held the envelope like it was something sharp. For a brief moment, my heart fluttered with an old, familiar hope. Maybe it was an invitation. Maybe my only son was reaching out, closing the distance that had stretched between us since my husband passed away 5 years ago. I ran a hand over the smooth surface, imagining gold-trimmed wedding invites, perhaps a sweet note from Ethan. Instead, the paper inside knocked the air from my lungs. It wasn't an invitation. It was an invoice. Bold numbers stared back at me. $100,000, itemized in two ruthless lines. $50,000 for the wedding at Silverwood Estate. $50,000 for a 3-week honeymoon in Santorini, Greece. No greeting, no warmth, just a curt handwritten note beneath the total. You should feel lucky to contribute after everything you put this family through. My knees weakened, and I dropped into one of the mismatched chairs in my kitchen. My hands trembled, the letter crackling slightly as I gripped it tighter. The walls seemed to close in, the soft morning light turning harsh. All those years of sacrifices, of living simply, pinching pennies after my husband Frank died, and this was my reward. Memories tumbled in. Endless overtime shifts, skipped vacations, old dresses mended over and over. I'd done it all for Ethan, to give him better, to send him to the best schools, pay off his college debt, even settle his rent when he struggled to hold down a job after college. I remembered the years of sleepless nights, worrying if I was doing enough, giving enough. And now, my only child had reduced me to nothing more than a walking wallet. I couldn't stop my mind from drifting to the day Ethan introduced me to Madeline Carter. She was beautiful, polished, with an air of effortless superiority. From the very first handshake, I knew she didn't see me as a person, only as a burden Ethan hadn't fully shaken off. They moved into the Carter family's renovated townhouse, attended lavish parties, and each phone call from Ethan grew shorter, each visit more strained, until eventually, the visits stopped altogether. Still, I had clung to hope. Hope that I mattered. Hope that the years of sacrifice meant something. But staring at the crisp, expensive paper in my hand, I realized just how invisible I'd become in my own child's life. Not even invited to the wedding, yet expected to foot the bill. My chest felt hollow, like something precious had been scooped out and discarded. I looked around my little kitchen, modest but clean. I glanced at the peeling linoleum floors I couldn't afford to replace, the secondhand curtains I'd hemmed myself. I thought of the simple dinners I ate alone, the quiet evenings filled with books and old memories. There was no extravagance in my life, no luxury, just quiet survival. And yet, they thought I had $100,000 to casually hand over for a celebration I wasn't even welcome to attend. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. My eyes drifted to the family photo I kept on the fridge. Ethan, no older than 8, beaming with his first trophy, Frank's proud arms slung over his shoulder. How had we gotten here? How had that little boy who used to call me his hero become this man who viewed me as nothing more than a bank account? I let the invoice slide from my hand, the paper floating down like an unwanted memory. It landed on the kitchen table, cold and impersonal, a symbol of how far Ethan had drifted. I sat there, staring at it, feeling the weight of 64 years pressing down on me, years of sacrifice, quiet endurance, and unconditional love. But beneath the hurt, beneath the suffocating betrayal, something new stirred. A whisper of resistance, a flicker of anger. My heart, weary as it was, still had some fight left in it. For the first time in my life, I asked myself a simple, startling question. When did I become so easy to discard? I reached for the letter one more time, not with the trembling hands of a heartbroken mother, but with the steady resolve of a woman who was finally seeing things clearly. I read the note again, this time not through tears, but through sharp, unflinching eyes. Every cruel word felt like fuel, feeding a fire I hadn't realized was still burning within me. They wanted me to pay without a seat at the table, to bankroll a celebration I wasn't worthy of witnessing, to stay silent while writing a six-figure check. Not this time. I stood, pushing back the chair, my joints protesting, but my spirit oddly steadier. My gaze lifted, not toward the framed photo on the fridge, but toward the reflection in the window. An older woman, yes, but one who had spent her life giving, sacrificing, and surviving. And perhaps it was time she stopped accepting crumbs. I left the invoice where it belonged, on the table, beneath the pile of unpaid bills and unanswered calls. A quiet reminder that I wasn't just someone's mother, someone's support system. I was Florence Mitchell, and this was not how my story was going to end. The memories returned like an old wound, tearing open, slow and painful. I sat in my quiet apartment, the invoice lying like poison on my kitchen table, and my mind drifted back to the last time I had seen Ethan. 2 years ago, Christmas Eve. I had baked his favorite sugar cookies, wrapped modest gifts I could afford, and made the long journey to his home in Crestwood Heights, a world far removed from my simple life in River Grove. I had dressed carefully that day, choosing a navy cardigan, the only good wool one I owned, and pressed slacks I'd kept pristine for special occasions. I wanted to feel like I belonged, to walk into my son's home and not feel out of place. Yet the moment Madeline opened the door, the air shifted. Her smile was thin, polite, but cold, her eyes scanning me up and down with a subtle grimace she didn't bother to hide. Her greeting was sharp and clipped. "Florence," she said, not Mom, not even Mrs. Mitchell. Just my name, like I was a guest, a burden they had to tolerate for the evening. The house gleamed with opulence, glass chandeliers, custom hardwood floors, walls adorned with curated art pieces. It wasn't just wealth that surrounded me, it was a statement that screamed, "You don't belong here." I remember standing in the entryway, clutching the tin of cookies in both hands, my palms sweating. I had rehearsed polite conversation topics on the bus ride over, determined to keep things light and pleasant. But Madeline wasted no time in letting me know where I stood. As I removed my coat, she glanced at my well-worn boots and sighed. "Just so you know, dinner is formal tonight," she said, her tone bordering on mocking, "but we'll make do." Ethan had been in the living room, laughing with some of Madeline's friends. When he saw me, his smile faltered for a second, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. I waited for him to come over, to wrap me in a hug, to greet me like a son should greet his mother. But he just lifted a hand in a casual wave and said, "Hey, Mom," before turning back to his conversation. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. I kept my back straight, my chin high, and followed Madeline into the dining room, where the table looked like something out of a magazine. White linens, gold chargers, crystal glasses, everything so painfully perfect it was suffocating. Throughout the night, the conversation danced around charity galas, European vacations, renovations on their vacation home. No one asked about me, about my life, about how I'd been managing after Frank's death. I sat there, invisible, a piece of old furniture moved into the corner to make space, but never acknowledged. At one point, Madeline leaned toward me, her smile like glass, sharp and false. "It's so lovely you could make it, Florence. Ethan and I have been discussing how important it is to maintain decorum in family gatherings. His father's passing was tragic, but I do believe it's time to move forward, don't you? We try to keep things tasteful in our home." Tasteful. I had to bite down on my tongue to stop the flood of emotion. Tasteful, as if my grief, my modest clothes, my life of penny pinching was somehow an eyesore in their carefully curated world. I looked at Ethan then, waiting for him to defend me, to remind his wife that I was not some unwanted relic. But he stared down at his wine glass, swirling the expensive red liquid, not a word of protest leaving his lips. That night, I had left early, fabricating a headache to escape the suffocating atmosphere. Ethan hadn't walked me to the door. Madeline had barely looked up from her phone when I announced my departure. The taxi ride back was a blur of Christmas lights and silent tears, my heart breaking in places I hadn't known existed. After that Christmas, the calls from Ethan dwindled until they stopped completely. My Facebook notifications, which once featured photos of Ethan's milestones, became barren. Eventually, I realized I had been blocked, cut off entirely from their curated digital world. The only update I had received since was the arrival of that invoice. Cold, detached, clinical. I sat now, 2 years later, rereading the harsh words in Ethan's handwriting. The more I read, the more something shifted inside me. What started as heartbreak transformed into a cold clarity. Every time I swallowed my pain, every time I made excuses for Ethan's behavior, every time I told myself things would get better, I had allowed this erosion of respect. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a slow, steady chipping away of my worth in my son's eyes, built brick by brick over years of silent endurance. And I had handed him the hammer every single time. No more. I didn't cry that day. My eyes stayed dry, my hands steady. The realization settled in my bones with a strange sense of calm. This wasn't new. This was simply the latest chapter in a long story of disregard. A story I had the power to end. I stood, brushing crumbs from my lap, the weight of shame lifting ever so slightly from my shoulders. The invoice remained on the table, but my heart felt lighter, stronger. The years of guilt, of sacrificing every bit of myself for a son who saw me as a bank account, stopped there. From this moment forward, I vowed to stop letting love blind me to disrespect. From this moment forward, I vowed to choose myself. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of purpose humming in my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like prey, waiting to be devoured by disappointment. I had spent my life giving without question, being agreeable, swallowing every slight and insult for the sake of peace. But now, with that cruel invoice sitting untouched on my kitchen table, I realized it was time I did something I had never done before: fight back. I made a cup of coffee, stronger than usual, sat down with my old laptop, and began to dig. I wasn't sure where to start, but after decades of being a mother, you develop certain instincts, especially when it comes to your own child. I started with what I still had access to: old friends, distant acquaintances, people who hadn't blocked me on social media. Scrolling through mutual friends' photos, I unearthed breadcrumbs Ethan and Madeline had left scattered across the internet. A check-in post at Silverwood Estate from one of Madeline's distant cousins. A tagged photo of a cake tasting with a hashtag I didn't recognize. An Instagram story screenshot someone had sent me a year ago, mentioning Santorini as honeymoon goals. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together, revealing the grand plan my son and his wife had orchestrated while pretending I didn't exist. Silverwood Estate wasn't just any wedding venue. It was one of the most exclusive places in the region, nestled in rolling hills, boasting a mansion with marble floors and a garden known for private events and society weddings. I looked up their wedding packages, starting at $40,000 and easily climbing higher with premium services. I moved on, cross-referencing details, confirming Madeline's registry at designer boutiques and a booking at the Elysian Villas in Santorini. Private pools, chefs, ocean views, the works. All of it paid for, in theory, by me. I chuckled, a bitter sound that echoed through my quiet kitchen. They hadn't just expected me to pay. They had built their fantasy on the assumption I would pay without protest, like a bank account with no overdraft limit, no opinion, no presence. I was good enough to bankroll their dreams, but not good enough to sit at their table. I dug deeper, tracking down the wedding planner. Her name was listed on the Silverwood website, Bianca Sloan. A few clicks led me to her professional site, dripping in pastel tones and extravagant testimonials from happy couples. I noted her number, her email, her office address in Glenville. I even pulled up reviews of the catering company, the photographers, the florists. I wanted to know every vendor, every service, every penny they had earmarked for me to cover. The more I read, the more a quiet strength settled over me. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't trapped. They had counted on my silence, on my enduring guilt, but they had underestimated me. They had forgotten that while I had been a mother first, I was also a woman who had survived loss, raised a child alone, navigated a world that hadn't always been kind. I closed the laptop and grabbed my financial folders from the side cabinet, the ones I usually avoided because the numbers inside reminded me how limited my life had become. But not today. Today I looked at them with clear eyes. I reviewed every account, every policy, every asset I had left. My small pension, my late husband's life insurance that was whittled down after medical bills, the modest savings I'd scraped together from budgeting every grocery trip, and the condo, my one true asset. I double-checked the ownership deed. Thankfully, I had never been foolish enough to co-sign anything with Ethan. The condo was mine, free and clear, and after today, it would be protected even further. I made a list of calls. First to my bank manager, who thankfully still remembered me from my working years. I asked about transferring my savings into a restricted trust account, shielding it from any unauthorized withdrawal or financial claim. Next, I scheduled an appointment with a local attorney to review my will, an update that had been long overdue. Ethan and Madeline would find themselves replaced by a quiet bequest to charities that actually valued human dignity. I also called my financial advisor, requesting they prepare documentation verifying my assets were fully allocated and inaccessible to any third-party claims. No hidden funds, no secret windfalls for them to chase after. They wanted my money. They'd have to deal with the truth. There was none for them to take. I could almost hear Ethan's entitled protests, Madeline's shrill disapproval. For the first time, instead of feeling guilt, I felt empowered. Every dollar I secured away was a step toward reclaiming my peace, my independence, my worth. By the time the afternoon sun filtered through my thin curtains, I felt exhausted but strangely whole. I had been running on empty for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to protect myself, to value my own needs above those who only remembered me when it was convenient. I stood, my joints protesting after hours at the dining table, and walked to the small mirror in my hallway. The woman staring back was older, yes, gray streaking her hair, laugh lines replaced by worry lines. But there was something different in her gaze. A quiet defiance, a long dormant fire reawakened. I hadn't fought for myself in decades, but I was learning again. Slowly, steadily, but without question. I traced the wrinkles around my mouth, the tired eyes that had seen too much disappointment, and smiled, not a sad smile, but one of resolve. The person reflected back at me wasn't weak. She wasn't broken. She had simply forgotten her own power. But not anymore. Not this time. This time, Florence Mitchell was not going down without a fight. I dressed with intention that morning, pulling out the one outfit in my closet that made me feel dignified and composed. A simple charcoal blouse, soft but structured, paired with pressed navy slacks and my most comfortable low-heeled shoes. I added my mother's old pearl earrings. Nothing flashy, just a quiet reminder to myself of the strong women I came from. No flashy labels, no over-the-top accessories, just the look of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she came for. The drive to Glenville was steady and uneventful, a quiet stretch of country highway giving me time to rehearse what I wanted to say. My knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as I rehearsed each word. I wasn't walking into that office to argue or explain. I was walking in to reclaim my ground. Bianca Sloane's office was everything I had imagined from her pastel-toned website. It sat on the second floor of a pristine glass front building overlooking the downtown square, her name printed in elegant cursive on a frosted door. I pushed it open, and the smell of lavender and vanilla wafted toward me. Every inch of the space was curated to perfection. Plush cream chairs, gold accents, perfectly arranged floral centerpieces. The walls were decorated with framed photographs of smiling brides in picturesque venues. "Mrs. Mitchell?" Bianca stood from her sleek white desk, moving toward me with the practiced warmth of someone used to charming high-profile clients. She was in her mid-30s, fashionable, polished, her platinum blonde hair twisted into a sleek bun. "I've been hoping to hear from you. I'm so glad you could make it." She gestured to one of the plush chairs in front of her glass desk. I settled into it, crossing my legs deliberately, back straight. Bianca sat opposite me, eyes bright, hands clasped together on the desk, like we were about to finalize a beautiful arrangement. "I have to say," she began with a smile, "your son and Madeline have exquisite taste. This is going to be a spectacular celebration. The venue, the decor choices, it's going to be the event of the season." I nodded politely, waiting for her to get to the point. "I understand Ethan mentioned you'd be taking care of the remaining balances. Most of our vendors have been wonderfully accommodating, but we're approaching final deadlines for some of the bigger payments. The venue, the floral installations, the private chef service at Elysian Villas." Bianca reached for a file folder on her desk and slid it across to me, the same type of folder I had seen in Ethan's invoice. "Here's a summary of the outstanding invoices. We can arrange a payment schedule or take care of everything in a lump sum, whatever's easiest for you." I didn't touch the folder. I took a slow, deliberate breath, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for her smile to falter slightly. "I won't be making any payments, Miss Sloan," I said, my voice calm but firm. Bianca blinked, her smile tightening but not disappearing. "Oh, well, I'm sure Ethan didn't mean to miscommunicate, but I was told you were covering the final costs." "I'm afraid there's been a massive misunderstanding," I continued, meeting her eyes squarely. "I have not agreed to pay for anything. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't invited. I wasn't involved in any decisions. I was simply sent a bill after the fact, without a single conversation." For a second, I saw the veneer of professionalism slip from Bianca's face. She sat up straighter, her fingers twitching over the papers in front of her. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, her tone more cautious now, "I was under the impression from both Ethan and Madeline that this was a family arrangement, that you had committed to helping with the wedding expenses, and perhaps there were family disagreements that delayed formalities." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Family arrangement? Is that what they called it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like financial exploitation. I received an invoice, not an invitation. Not a phone call, not a discussion, an invoice." Bianca swallowed, her confident posture shrinking just a bit. I leaned forward, my tone lowering, sharper now. "Tell me, Miss Sloan, whose names are on the signed contracts? Who signed the binding agreements with you and your vendors?" She hesitated for a beat before flipping through the file. "Ethan Mitchell and Madeline Carter," she admitted quietly. "Exactly," I said, sitting back. "Not Florence Mitchell. I haven't signed anything, haven't committed to anything, and I have absolutely no legal or financial responsibility toward this wedding or honeymoon." Bianca's lips pressed into a thin line, the warmth draining from her eyes, replaced by quiet calculation. I could see the gears turning behind her professional facade. Her commission likely depended on these payments coming through, and the foundation beneath her was beginning to crack. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell. I truly wasn't aware." I waved a hand dismissively. "I'm not here to make your life difficult, Miss Sloan. I understand you're running a business, and you deserve to be paid for your work, but you will not be paid by me. If Ethan and Madeline misrepresented my involvement, that's something you'll need to address with them." Bianca sat back, exhaling slowly. "I suppose I will." "Good," I replied. "And here's what I want you to do. When Ethan contacts you again, and I'm sure he will, I want you to tell him exactly what I've told you, that no funds are coming from me, that I had no prior agreement, and that if he has any questions or complaints, he can pick up the phone and call his mother himself, directly." Bianca nodded, subdued now, the reality of the situation sinking in. I stood, smoothing the front of my blouse, feeling lighter, freer, as if with every word I had peeled off another layer of guilt that had weighed me down for years. "One more thing," I added, pausing as I reached the door. "Please don't take any of this personally. I'm sure you do wonderful work, but I'm done financing people who can't even show me basic respect." Bianca's lips parted, a soft breath escaping, but she said nothing. I didn't wait for her to respond. I stepped out of that office, out of that glossy, fake little world, and back into the open air. The sun felt warmer on my skin than it had in a long time. My steps felt steadier, my heart lighter. I had cut the chain that tethered me to their demands, their entitlement, their manipulation. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, an apology, or a penny. For the first time in my life, I chose myself, and it felt damn good. The next morning, I sat by my window, the soft hum of the town filling the quiet air around me. I wasn't angry anymore. Something deeper had settled inside me, something calmer, stronger. I felt awake in a way I hadn't felt in years. I stared out toward the neighboring hills, toward Maplebrook, the small town a few miles from River Grove, where life moved just a little slower. And there, I remembered someone I hadn't thought about in far too long. Donna Harper. I first met Donna nearly 2 decades ago when we both worked at the same hospital. She had been a young, terrified mother then, raising a baby on her own after a divorce that left her penniless. I'd stepped in where I could, babysitting occasionally, helping with groceries, sharing meals. Donna had always said I was like family when she had none. Over the years, life moved on, and we drifted apart, as people often do. But now, the thought of Donna brought with it a strange sense of comfort. She had always been strong, resilient, unafraid to fight for herself when life tried to grind her down. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my old contacts, half afraid the number wouldn't work anymore. But when I hit dial, the line didn't go dead. It rang, and on the third ring, I heard her voice, warm and familiar. "Florence, is that really you?" she said, laughter already curling into her words. I swallowed the lump in my throat and smiled, even though she couldn't see me. "It's me, Donna, and I think I'm long overdue for catching up." Within the hour, we agreed to meet at a little coffee shop in Maplebrook. When I arrived, Donna was already there, seated at a corner table, her camera bag slung over the back of her chair. Her smile was the same, lines carved a little deeper into her face, but her eyes just as alive. She hugged me tight, and I felt a part of myself relax for the first time in weeks. We talked about everything: her business, her daughter now grown and thriving, the small photography studio she had built from scratch. She had transitioned from family portraits to event photography, weddings especially, and she shared stories of the extravagant affairs she'd captured, of wealthy families throwing parties that could feed entire towns. I listened, then shared my own story. Slowly, carefully, I unfolded every detail: Ethan, Madeline, the invoice, the exclusion, the manipulation. I told her everything, from the coldness in Ethan's voice to the smug note scribbled on the bottom of the bill. Donna's jaw tightened, her face flashing with the kind of protective fury only another mother could understand. "I can't stop the wedding, Donna," I said quietly. "And I don't want to. But I do want proof. I want to document what happens, the way they treat me, the way they treat everyone else. I want evidence of their entitlement, not because I want to ruin their day, but because I want to reclaim my own." Donna leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "You don't need to explain it to me. You were there for me when no one else was. You helped me stand when life wanted me to break. You don't have to ask, I'm in." She explained how the Silverwood Estate grounds were partially accessible, how there were public walkways nearby that could offer her clear vantage points without trespassing. She'd done similar work before: quiet, discreet documentation for clients who needed to protect themselves. I felt a surge of gratitude swell in my chest. I wasn't alone in this. For the first time in a long time, I had an ally. Donna pulled out her phone and began mapping out possible angles, timing, best light for photographs, and even ways to discreetly capture audio when necessary. She showed me simple apps I could download on my phone, ways to record calls, save voice messages, and back up files so nothing could be conveniently lost. She walked me through every step: how to respond to Ethan's calls without emotion, how to keep every interaction factual and documented, how to protect myself from the legal games Madeline's family might try to play. When I got home, I felt energized in a way I couldn't quite describe. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was acting. I was preparing myself for whatever storm came next, not as a helpless mother, but as a woman reclaiming control over her life. That evening, I sat down at my small desk with a legal pad and began to update my will. I hadn't touched it in years, always assuming that everything would naturally go to Ethan. But that assumption was gone, burned away by the realization that my only child saw me as nothing more than a transaction. I contacted my attorney, a kind older man named Richard, who had handled Frank's affairs when he passed. I told him I wanted to revise everything. Ethan and Madeline would be removed completely. Instead, the remainder of my estate would go to the Women's Dignity Foundation, a charity I had quietly supported for years, one that helped women in abusive relationships rebuild their lives. I thought of the younger me, struggling in the aftermath of Frank's sudden death, trying to keep a roof over Ethan's head. I thought of Donna, of the women who came through the hospital doors every day with no place to go. This was where my legacy would rest, not in funding a wedding I wasn't invited to, but in giving dignity back to those who had been stripped of it. By the end of the week, every document had been updated, every account protected. The trust account was sealed, the will notarized, the recordings backed up. I hadn't just closed a door, I had fortified it. That Friday evening, I walked to the local market and bought a bottle of the good red wine. Not the cheapest one I always grabbed out of habit, but one I'd seen recommended in the little community newsletter. I stopped at the bakery and picked up a fresh loaf of crusty bread, a wedge of brie, and a handful of ripe strawberries. At home, I set the table just for myself. My mother's old porcelain plates, a cloth napkin, a candle I hadn't lit in years. I poured myself a glass of that deep red wine and let it breathe. Sitting at that little kitchen table, I wasn't just eating dinner. I was celebrating a quiet victory. For the first time in 40 years, I chose myself, and it felt like the sweetest, most nourishing thing in the world. That night, as I leaned back in my chair sipping my wine, I smiled. Not because life had suddenly become easy, but because for once, I was no longer begging for scraps of respect. I was standing tall in my own quiet dignity, and that was worth everything. The first call came just 2 days after my meeting with Bianca. I had expected it, but the shrill tone in Ethan's voice still sent a chill down my spine. The number flashed across my phone screen, and for a brief second the mother in me hesitated. Should I let it go to voicemail? But something inside me, something stronger, steadier, told me to pick up. "Mom," Ethan's voice started, clipped and irritated. "What the hell is going on?" I stayed calm, my voice even. "Good morning, Ethan." "Don't play polite," he snapped. "Bianca called me in a panic. She said you refused to pay. You told her you never agreed to cover anything. Is that true?" I looked out the window, watching the gentle sway of trees in the distance. "Yes, it's true." His breath caught for a second, then came the anger I knew would follow. "Are you serious? You're really going to ruin my wedding because of some petty grudge?" I smiled to myself. There it was, the default setting. My son, once sweet and bright-eyed, had grown into a man who could turn his own neglect of me into my fault. I took a slow breath. "Ethan, I'm not ruining anything. I was never invited, never consulted, and never asked. I'm simply not paying for a wedding I have no part in." He scoffed, the sound sharp in my ear. "This is exactly why we didn't want you there. You always make things about yourself." A dull ache pressed at my chest, but I swallowed it. "If that's what you believe, then you should also believe I have no responsibility for your expenses." He launched into a tirade about how I always sabotaged his life, how I never supported his choices, how I was ruining his relationship with Madeline. Words flew fast, accusations I had heard in different forms over the years. I stayed quiet, letting him rant, because I knew no response would satisfy him. "I thought maybe this time you'd finally do something decent," he finished, his voice trembling, though whether it was from anger or desperation, I couldn't tell. "But no, you had to make this about you again." I kept my tone steady, unshaken. "You made this about me, Ethan. You sent me a bill, not a wedding invitation." Before he could respond, I ended the call. My hand didn't shake, my chest didn't tighten, and for the first time after speaking with my son, I didn't feel small. I felt relief. That evening, Madeline's number lit up my phone. I let it go to voicemail. She called again the next morning. I answered. "Florence," she started with mock sweetness, her voice sugar-coated but tight. "Look, I understand you're upset, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. This is Ethan's wedding. Your son. His happiest day. Don't you want him to be happy?" I leaned back in my chair, eyeing the untouched cup of tea on my table. I do want him to be happy, but happiness shouldn't come from manipulating others. Her tone shifted immediately, the saccharine coating peeling away. "You do realize people will know what you've done, right? It won't take much for people to see you for what you are, bitter, selfish, unwilling to support your own son." I shook my head slowly, though she couldn't see me. "Madeline, I won't be guilted into paying for a wedding I wasn't deemed worthy to attend. Her breath came out in an angry puff. Ethan is devastated. Is that what you wanted? To humiliate him? To make a spectacle? I smiled, small and quiet. If you wanted me to be part of his happiness, you should have included me in his joy. You can't demand my money while denying me my place in his life. She called me cold, heartless, and a few other words I let slide past me like wind through leaves. I didn't defend myself because I had nothing to defend. I was simply stating facts. The next day, Ethan called again. This time his voice cracked beneath the anger. I don't understand, Mom. After everything I've been through, after everything you put me through growing up, I thought you'd at least do this one thing for me. My fingers traced the rim of my teacup. You decided I wasn't good enough for your big day, Ethan. You decided I wasn't someone you wanted to stand beside you when you made a commitment for life. You made your choice. Now you need to live with it. Silence stretched on the line before his voice returned, quieter, almost broken. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of decades slide off my shoulders. Then maybe you should have treated your mother like someone who deserved to be there. He didn't respond. The line went quiet, and I waited until he hung up. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The calls stopped after that. No more frantic texts, no more guilt-laced voicemails, just silence. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I wasn't the villain in this story. I wasn't the monster who ruined her son's wedding. I was a mother who finally drew a line, a woman who chose her dignity over forced obligation. And for the first time, the quiet felt comforting, like standing in a clearing after years of wandering a storm. It felt like freedom. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and turns everything dull. I woke up naturally, no alarm, no urgency, just the quiet hum of my little apartment wrapped around me like a protective cocoon. There was no need to rush, no reason to be anywhere, but exactly where I was. While my son and his bride were scrambling at Silverwood Estate, I took my time preparing a simple breakfast, pouring myself a cup of good coffee, and settling into the comfort of my small kitchen. The clock on the wall struck 9 when the first message came through from Donna. I picked up my phone and read it slowly, a small smile curling on my lips. Vendors packing up. Caterer demanded full cash payment by 8. No payment, no service. Left with all the food. Attached was a photo from a distance, a truck pulling away from the estate's pristine white gates. I placed the phone down and poured myself another cup of coffee. No panic, no regret. I had made my choice, and the consequences of their actions were unfolding exactly as they should. There was something strangely comforting about knowing I no longer bore the weight of their irresponsible choices. An hour later, another message. Florist just left. Staff taking back centerpieces. Madeline is screaming in the courtyard. I imagined the chaos. Expensive dresses fluttering in the wind, angry calls being made, Madeline's perfectly curated image cracking under pressure. A mother might have felt sorry for her child on their wedding day, but I didn't feel sorrow. I felt clarity. Clarity that this moment was the inevitable result of years of disrespect and entitlement. By noon, Donna sent another update. Photographer gone, refused to work without payment, only one decorator left taking down linens, guests starting to arrive. No staff to greet them. I pictured the guests pulling up in sleek cars, stepping into confusion, their heels clicking against the marble driveway, their faces twisted in irritation as no staff greeted them. No champagne glasses were offered. Whispers turning into gasps, confusion rolling through the crowd like a wave. I could almost hear Madeline's shrill voice rising over the hush of embarrassed guests. I prepared myself a light lunch, slicing into fresh bread I had bought the day before, pairing it with soft cheese and a small bowl of fruit. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, letting the peace of my little home settle into my bones. Outside, the rain began to pour heavier, and I imagined the manicured gardens at Silverwood turning muddy, the chairs for the outdoor ceremony left unused. In the early afternoon, Donna's next message came, and this time I could hear the excitement even through her text. Venue manager pulled the plug, no payment, no event, guests leaving, Madeline sobbing in the bridal suite, Ethan furious, absolute meltdown. I sat back, letting out a long breath, feeling the tension I had carried for years melt away. This wasn't revenge. This was the natural order of things correcting itself. For decades, I had paid, sacrificed, made myself small so Ethan could feel big. I had excused every slight, forgiven every insult, covered every debt, but not anymore. This time, I hadn't rescued him. I hadn't written the check. I hadn't cleaned up the mess. And now, he stood surrounded by the consequences of his own choices. I waited until evening to make myself a special dinner. Pasta with a rich tomato sauce, a salad with crisp greens, and a warm slice of garlic bread. I set the table just for me, pulling out the nice plates I rarely used. Then I opened the bottle of red wine I had been saving, the one tucked in the back of my cupboard for a special day. Today was that day. As I ate, my phone continued to buzz, but I ignored it. I didn't need to hear the excuses or the pleas. I didn't need to listen to the anger. I had listened enough over the years. Tonight, I listened only to myself, to the quiet peace of my home, to the rain tapping softly against the window. When dinner was done, I moved to my favorite armchair by the window, glass of wine in hand, watching the world darken outside. The city lights blinked on one by one, reflections dancing in the puddles. My phone buzzed again, a final message from Donna. All guests gone. Staff packing up. Venue locked. It's over. I took a long sip of the deep red wine, feeling the warmth slide down my throat, spreading through my chest like a quiet, comforting fire. My eyes drifted closed for a moment, the soft hum of the rain and the distant hush of traffic the only sounds around me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel used. I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like a wallet with a pulse. I felt free. Not because I had ruined anything, but because I had finally refused to carry burdens that were never mine to bear. I had stepped back and let the truth unfold. I had allowed the illusions to crumble, and in doing so, I had reclaimed something far more precious than their approval, my dignity. I raised my glass to no one but myself and whispered softly, "Here's to peace." And for the first time in years, I truly meant it. The knock came just after 11 the next morning, sharp and impatient, echoing through my quiet apartment. I glanced through the peephole, already knowing who it was before I even looked. Ethan stood there, soaked from the drizzle, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled. Behind him, Madeline hovered, arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeves of her designer coat. Her eyes darted around the hallway, her expression a cocktail of frustration and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend how their perfectly planned world had crumbled overnight. I took a steady breath before opening the door, keeping the security chain in place. My voice was calm, measured. "Ethan, Madeline." "Mom," Ethan breathed out, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide and frantic, rimmed with red from what I assumed was a sleepless night. "Please, please let us come in. We need to talk." I looked at them both, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The small, familiar ache tugged at my chest, the mother's instinct to comfort, to fix, to make things better. But it was fleeting. The weight of years pressed firmer, grounding me in my decision. I opened the door fully and stepped aside just enough for them to enter. 5 minutes, I said simply. They shuffled in, Ethan moving with a heavy limp of defeat, Madeline with the rigid posture of someone barely holding herself together. They stood in my tiny living room, dwarfed by the plain walls and secondhand furniture, and for a brief moment, I wondered if it dawned on them how little they had cared about this space, about this life I had lived without them. Ethan was the first to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Mom, this got way out of hand. I was wrong, okay? I know I was wrong, but you can't just destroy everything like this." I tilted my head slightly, watching him with quiet, steady eyes. "Destroy everything?" He ran a shaky hand through his damp hair, pacing in the small space between my worn couch and coffee table. "You didn't have to make it so final. We were going to fix things. We talked about postponing, scaling back. We were going to make it right and invite you properly this time." Madeline cut in, her voice sharp around the edges. "Everything fell apart because you sabotaged it. Because you made it about proving some point. You humiliated us." The calm that settled inside me was something I couldn't explain, like a quiet sea after a long storm, steady and unshaken. I didn't flinch. I didn't recoil. I simply let the words slide past me like water off stone. I stood straighter, my voice unshaken. You humiliated yourselves. Ethan's jaw tensed. Mom, please. You don't understand. People are gonna talk. This isn't just about us anymore. Everyone's asking questions, wondering what happened. You've ruined our reputations. I allowed a small, humorless smile to tug at my lips. Oh, now you care about my effect on your life? Funny, since you haven't cared about mine for years. He flinched as if struck, his shoulders sagging. I know we made mistakes, but you can't punish us like this. I took a slow breath, letting the words form carefully before I released them. Ethan, for years, I gave everything. Every spare dime, every ounce of energy, every bit of myself. I sacrificed without question, stood quietly while you drifted further away. I accepted being forgotten, excluded, insulted, all because I believed that's what good mothers do. He swallowed hard, his lips trembling. I continued, my voice steel wrapped in softness. But you made it perfectly clear what I was to you. You didn't invite me to your wedding, Ethan. You didn't want me there, except as a silent benefactor, a blank check. You didn't think about my feelings, my dignity, my worth. You thought about my wallet. Madeline shifted, discomfort flashing across her face, but she stayed quiet. So no, I said, squaring my shoulders. I didn't ruin anything. You did. With your entitlement, with your disrespect, with your audacity to believe I owed you everything while you gave me nothing. Ethan's chest heaved, his voice dropping to a broken murmur. I made a mistake. I got caught up in everything. But I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything? My throat tightened, the old ache rising, but I swallowed it down, keeping my head high. It used to mean everything, but now it means you'll have to stand on your own. Madeline's lips parted in shock, her hands balling into fists. So that's it? You're just cutting us off? I nodded slowly. You cut me off a long time ago. I'm simply returning the favor. Ethan took a shaky step forward, desperation seeping into every inch of his posture. We can fix this. We'll cancel everything. We'll start over. A small wedding. Invite you properly. Mom, please. My heart, once so easily swayed, stayed firm, solid as rock beneath my ribs. I shook my head gently. I don't want scraps of inclusion after being treated like a burden. I don't want invitations born of guilt. I want respect, Ethan, and that, you've shown me, you cannot give. He sagged, the fight draining from his body. Madeline looked away, her jaw clenched, her shoulders stiff. I walked to the door, opened it, and stood tall. From now on, you will live within your means. You will learn to solve your own problems. You will learn what it feels like to stand without leaning on me. That is the greatest gift I can give you now. Ethan's eyes glistened, his voice barely a whisper. Mom, but I was done. I had said what needed to be said. I stepped aside, motioned toward the door. Madeline stormed out first, her heels clicking angrily down the hall. Ethan lingered, eyes full of a sadness I no longer had the strength to carry for him. And when he finally turned and walked through the door, I closed it behind him, firm and final. My hand lingered on the handle, my chest expanding with a breath that felt like freedom. I locked the door, turned away, and in the silence of my little home, I realized I had finally done what I never thought I could. I chose myself. And I wasn't sorry. Not for a single second. The days that followed were quieter than I could have imagined, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt restful. The constant knot in my chest that had weighed me down for years began to unravel, little by little. I woke up without the heaviness of obligation, without the looming fear of disappointing people who had long stopped caring about me. I woke up simply as myself, Florence Mitchell, a woman who had given her life to others and finally decided it was time to give something back to herself. With the storm behind me, I began to explore what it meant to live for myself. It started small. I joined a local yoga class at the community center, feeling awkward in my basic workout clothes among a sea of perfectly postured women in designer activewear. But the instructor, a kind woman named Elise, welcomed me with warmth. I struggled through the first few sessions, my body stiff from years of neglect, but each week it got easier. My breath became steadier, my movements stronger, and with every stretch, I felt my spirit unfurling, shedding old burdens I didn't need to carry anymore. Donna became more than a friend again. She became my partner in rediscovery. We took short weekend trips, exploring nearby towns, walking along riverbanks, trying local cafes and small museums. We'd always been too busy to notice. Sometimes we'd just sit on park benches, people watching, and sharing stories of who we had been and who we were becoming. I saw Donna's business flourish too. Word spread quickly through my small circle of friends, friends who had daughters and nieces and granddaughters, planning weddings, who valued honesty and compassion. Donna's calendar filled up with bookings, not just for weddings, but for anniversaries, family portraits, and community events. Watching her thrive made me feel like I'd planted a seed in good soil, and now it was blooming beyond either of our expectations. For the first time in decades, I gave myself permission to spend money on me without guilt. I renovated my little apartment, not extravagantly, but enough to make it feel fresh and new. I replaced the tired curtains with soft linen ones that let in more light. I bought a cozy armchair, perfect for reading by the window. I repainted the walls in soft blues and greens, colors that made me feel calm and alive. I enrolled in a cooking class downtown, something I had always wanted to do but never allowed myself. I learned to bake crusty sourdough bread, perfect flaky pastries, and even mastered a few Italian recipes that had always intimidated me. Cooking became more than survival. It became a joy, a creative outlet, a quiet celebration of living life on my own terms. I joined a book club at the local library. Every Thursday evening, I found myself surrounded by women of all ages, discussing novels, sharing perspectives, laughing over tea and cookies. We debated characters, themes, endings, and in those moments, I didn't feel like someone's forgotten mother or abandoned widow. I felt like a woman with opinions, with a voice, with a community that valued her presence. One rainy afternoon, while sipping my tea and flipping through a community newsletter, I came across an article about the struggles of single mothers in our county. Stories of women left to fend for themselves, scraping by on minimum wages, trying to keep food on the table while the world turned a blind eye. It stirred something deep inside me, a reflection of the woman I had once been, the battles I had silently fought. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter to the Women's Dignity Foundation, the same charity I had included in my will. I wanted to do more than leave behind money after I was gone. I wanted to make an impact while I was still here. I worked with their rector to set up a small support program in my late husband's name, the Frank Mitchell Grant, dedicated to helping single mothers access emergency funds, career training, and childcare support. Every time I attended a fundraiser or volunteered my time with the foundation, I felt connected to something larger than myself, something purposeful. I wasn't just living in the shadow of my sacrifices. I was shaping a legacy built on compassion and strength. As the weeks turned into months, I marveled at how full my life became when I stopped pouring myself into people who saw me as a convenience. My days were filled with books, yoga, good food, meaningful friendships, and purposeful work. I no longer worried about who was calling me or who wasn't, about who needed me or who forgot me. I had finally become my own priority. Sometimes I would sit by my window in the evenings, a cup of tea cradled in my hands, watching the golden glow of streetlights flicker on. I would think back on the years I spent shrinking myself to fit into someone else's expectations, on the countless times I bit my tongue, swallowed my feelings, and opened my wallet just to be accepted. Not anymore. I wasn't Florence Mitchell, the forgotten mother, the silent supporter, the convenient benefactor. I was Florence Mitchell, a woman who had rediscovered her own voice, her own joy, her own dignity. I was living proof that it was never too late to reclaim yourself. And in the quiet comfort of my small but happy life, I felt peace, not the hollow silence of being ignored, but the soft, soothing peace of being free. A few months drifted by, peaceful and quiet, before the inevitable happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I opened my email, and there it was. Ethan's name sitting in my inbox, bold and unread. For a moment, my fingers hovered over the trackpad, my heart steady, not anxious like it might have been before. I clicked it open, curious but no longer tethered to his words in the way I used to be. The email was exactly what I had expected. It started with a greeting that felt distant, not warm, just formal enough to pretend civility. Then came the string of apologies, carefully structured, but the more I read, the more I recognized the same old rhythm I'd known for years. An apology dressed in excuses. Ethan spoke of pressure, of social expectations, of being caught between Madeline's demands and his own pride. He wrote about being overwhelmed, about how things spiraled, about how he was forced to make certain decisions, how everything had gotten out of hand. It wasn't a letter of remorse, it was a letter of justification. He didn't ask how I had been. He didn't wonder if I was happy or safe or healthy. He only acknowledged the fallout of his choices when it directly affected him: his embarrassment, his struggle, his fractured relationships. There was no accountability, no understanding of the root of our distance, just a clumsy attempt to bridge a gap without ever crossing the bridge himself. I read the email through twice, not because it swayed me, but because it reminded me how far I'd come. Months ago, this message might have shattered me, stirred guilt like a storm in my chest. But now, all I felt was clarity, calm, unmovable clarity. I didn't reply. I didn't send a carefully worded response or offer forgiveness he hadn't truly earned. I simply archived the email, letting it rest in the quiet corners of my digital life as a soft reminder, a lesson about boundaries, about how easy it was to slip back into old roles if I wasn't vigilant. I wasn't angry, nor was I triumphant. I was simply free. Later that evening, I walked down to the riverbank in River Grove, my favorite little spot where the current whispered over smooth stones and the willow branches danced in the breeze. I sat on the weathered wooden bench, breathing in the crisp air, letting the rhythm of the water ease me further into my newfound peace. I thought about everything: the years I had spent wrapped in sacrifice, the choices I made believing they were for love, the times I had silenced my own needs in the name of motherhood. I thought about Ethan as a little boy, about the version of me who had believed that endless giving would create an unbreakable bond. I thought about the betrayal, the realization, the awakening that had turned my life in a new direction. I thought about the stillness I had now, about the mornings I woke up without fear or guilt, about the simple joy of choosing for myself every single day. Sitting there by the river, I asked myself the question that had lingered quietly in the back of my mind: did I regret it? Did I regret drawing that line in the sand? Did I regret choosing myself after so many years of being overlooked? The answer came as naturally as the breeze that kissed my skin. No, I didn't regret it. Not for a second. I didn't regret finally standing tall after being bent by obligation. I didn't regret embracing my worth after years of being diminished. I didn't regret choosing peace over chaos, dignity over desperation, self-respect over the empty promise of family ties that only worked one way. Because what I learned, sitting by that river with the water glinting in the fading sunlight, was that motherhood is a role, but womanhood is an identity. Love is sacred, but it's not unconditional when it becomes a tool of exploitation. And my life, my simple, quiet, beautiful life, was worth defending. I smiled to myself, a soft, knowing smile. The kind of smile that comes not from victory over others, but from victory over the parts of myself that once believed I wasn't enough on my own. As the sky turned shades of amber and rose, I stood, dusted off my jeans, and turned toward home. My steps were steady, my heart light. I was no longer chasing approval. I was no longer begging for love dressed as obligation. I was no longer shrinking to fit the mold of what someone else thought I should be. I was Florence Mitchell, a woman who gave, who sacrificed, who loved fiercely, but who in the end chose herself. And it was the best decision I had ever made. Have you ever found yourself giving everything to someone who barely noticed you were there? Have you ever been treated like a convenience instead of a person, like your love was only valuable when it came with a price tag? I know I'm not the only one who's felt invisible in their own family. Maybe you've been through it too. Maybe you've swallowed your feelings for years just to keep peace, just to be included. But what if we stopped apologizing for simply asking to be respected? What if we started choosing ourselves without guilt? If this story touched something in you, if it made you think of your own journey, your own worth, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences matter. Your voice deserves to be heard. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about strength, quiet dignity, and the power of reclaiming your life, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. Thank you for listening. And remember, your worth was never measured by how much you gave.